So we were discussing tracking and NoTracking and how by default Entity Framework uses tracking. So i.e. if you grab some data using a query and store it in a variable. So here we're just getting a student ID of 1. First or default basically means if there is a student found, then return the student, otherwise use the default value. So here what we are going to do is we're going to update the student name and we're going to take save changes over here. So by using this save changes method over here, what this will do is update the database set. You also have the NoTracking option. So as you can see, the difference between this is the same, and the only difference is that this method have been added on before we execute the first or default query. And here we're just looking at the same student 1. So what will happen is with this query, it will load the student, store it in the same variable, just as it would do over here. So it's just getting the student. And now at this point, we're updating the student variable here, student2, to new name. But because we use NoTracking, what will happen is when you do save changes here versus save changes here, the method over here, this one will not save changes back to the database. So what you can do instead is, let's say you made loads of changes, some logic and so on, and at the end you want to update the database. So what you can do is you can just pass that variable, which is the student2 variable, into context students update method over here, and this will take the student and then do the necessary changes that have happened and then save the changes. So let's try this. Let's do it without using this method. So what we should find is it will change this student name to updated name for student 1, but it won't change it to new name. So if I were to run this program, before we run the program, let's have a look at our data. So student 1, ID 1, we've got Ali here, and we want to change his name. So it should only change the student and not Sarah or John. So let's run our application over here, and you can see our application is running and it has finished executing. So if we go over to our database over here, and I'm just going to run this query again by clicking on this execute button, and you can see the student name has changed to updated name, but it has not changed to new name. So you can see over here that we went with new name here, and that's not reflected in the database. So what we can do is we can enable these lines over here. So even though we are not using tracking here, but let's now assume that we changed our mind and we do want to update, then what we can do is we can run this update method, pass it to the student number 2, which is the one that will have this new name, and then we're going to give save changes. So if I run this over here now, and you can see our code have finished executing. So if we go to the database, you can see previously with updated name. So if we now execute this, and you can see it has changed to new name here, which is what we wanted to do. So just remember, tracking, NoTracking basically doesn't allow updating the data, but it does allow read-only large data reads, disconnected scenarios such as web APIs and caching of the data locally, while tracking basically allows you to update it. But even if you use NoTracking, then you can still use the update method here against your DB set, which is basically a table. So against the context of your database connection, using the student's model, you can actually pass it back a student that you found here, even though NoTracking was used, and still save changes to the database.